of the day for one of our most popular speakers in a long time on a very popular topic. We have Mark Pulsifer, and Mark, a number of you will recognize Mark from past presentations of various things. Mark has become quite a speaker. He's also a part-time prof at St. X. He had a nice long-term career with the Department of Natural Resources. Before retiring in 2020, Mark spent 33 years with the department as a wildlife biologist as well as a regional manager. In his final 2 years, he was heavily involved with a variety of projects stemming from the Leahy Forestry Review, which we've heard so much about over the years. During his years as a biologist, Mark managed several long-term projects focusing on the conservation biology of such things as wood turtles, moose, freshwater mussels, and old-growth forest. Since retiring, Mark has started his own wildlife consulting business, and he's traveled the maritime provinces, speaking to landowners about the value of ecological forestry practices for biodiversity. Welcome, Mark.
Okay. Well, I have 6.5 minutes now to get through my presentation, so looking forward to that. The last time I gave this presentation, it was 2.5 hours long. So I've cut it down considerably, and I'm going to be running through it a little bit quicker perhaps than normal. But I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Don has said, I have had the pleasure of getting around to some of the other provinces to talk about ecological forestry, and in particular, talking about the biodiversity aspects of ecological forestry and the values for both. So, one of the reasons I enjoy doing this, meeting landowners and private woodlot owners, is because we all have a good vested interest in biodiversity in general. Many of us, we hunt, we fish, we like to photograph things, we like to get on a property and mountain bike or just do hiking in general. And so, those are all really great values, I think, that basically we enjoy in our woodlot, and conserving biodiversity is part of that. The other part of that is that basically when we come down to it, you guys are the primary landowners in the province, and so you have a huge impact on the conservation of wildlife / biodiversity in general. And so that's another reason why I like to get out and meet you people, because you have such a potentially beneficial impact on the amount of on different populations that are out there. The Leahy Review has come up several times already, and I like to sort of preface what I talk about a little bit by just recognizing that William Leahy recognized the value of biodiversity and ecosystem conservation with respect to what his forestry review was, and not that it's better in any one particular form or fashion, but because biodiversity is the foundation of everything that we do. And I'm always reminding people that working woodlots, that's biodiversity. That's just one aspect of biodiversity. So it's not always just what some people tend to think of, well, they're talking about the bees and the butterflies and things like that. We're all dealing with biodiversity on a day-to-day basis. But what is biodiversity? Another concept that I like to get out there, people often think of it as just, it's what we see around us. It's the different species, it's the variety of life. And in fact, that's what it is. But we also look at it at different scales. We look at biodiversity in the concept of genetics. We look at the biodiversity in the sense of species themselves, but we also look at the conservation of ecosystems. And over time, things have changed so much in this department. When Don and I were brand new to the Department of Lands and Forests way back in the 80s, you know, really, if you were a forest manager, you really only had to know, you had to know how to grow 6 species of trees and when to cut them. Biologists primarily concern themselves with the game species that we chased it, we shot it, we ate it. And over the years, that's changed now. Now we're getting into soil dynamics, we're getting into nutrient regimes, we're getting into forest ecosystem conservation, we're getting into veg types. So if anybody's really done a deep dive into the SGEM document, the Soil Culture Guide to Ecological Matrix, you know all about those things. You know about the forest ecosystem classification, those guys, ecosites, all those types of things. So forest management, and by association, biodiversity management, has become much more complex than it ever used to be. And that's a good thing. Science is helping us progress along the lines. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons why biodiversity is important, and and certainly one of those is these things called forest ecosystem services or ecosystem services. Yeah, okay, thanks. Ecosystem services are basically things that nature provides to us for free. And we often take them for granted because they are free. We don't give much thought to it. But biodiversity is the foundation of all of that. So when we think about water purification or air purification or soil formation or pollination or nutrient exchange, those are all things that are done for us for nothing that actually have a cost. And we just finished talking a little bit about carbon capture, and we can get our heads around carbon a little bit in terms of the actual value. But when it comes to water filtration and wetlands, for instance, the value of wetlands in Nova Scotia, the water filtration and cleansing, is $2.2 billion a year. The value of bats for pollination and for insect control is not in Nova Scotia, but on the eastern seaboard, is somewhere between $4 and $8 billion a year. So these are things that we don't think about until they're gone. And so, value of wood. We know more about the value of wood than anything else. But there are so many different types of ecosystem services that are out there that it's a hot topic these days in terms of trying to evaluate what's going on. One of the particular studies that was done by Toronto Dominion Economics was taking a look at the Acadian forest. Look at that value right there, $26,250 per hectare. That's what ecosystem services, that includes the cost of wood, but only a small handful of ecosystem services are actually worth that much, $26,000. And for those of you that are harvesting wood, if you can make $2,000 per hectare clear, you're probably doing okay. But there's other values there as well. And so that's some of the reasons why biodiversity is important and why we want to be thinking about it. With forest management and with the SGEM and with ecological forestry and all those things, basically one of the messages that I want to bring home to you is the fact that what we leave behind is just as important, if not more important, than what we take off. What we leave behind is going to be the foundation for habitat. It's going to provide the conditions under which the next generation of trees are going to grow. And so I think just for those reasons in particular, it's going to help soil production. There's a number of different ecosystem services, as I just mentioned, that this is going to be valuable for. And so this is the reason why we pay a lot of attention to what we refer to as retention, things you leave behind after. So basically, I just mentioned this, the ecological value of retention. We're talking about long-term here. So basically, we talk about soil recovery, soil nutrients. We talk about habitat. We talk about providing the right conditions for the next crop of trees. Stand development, those are all very important things that retention does for us. With respect to the biological side of things, by leaving trees behind, either as individual trees or small patches of trees, you're providing a function here referred to as lifeboating. There are certain species that can't get out of the way, right? So a deer is going to run off the property, it's going to go next door, or a bird's going to fly next door, or a kilometer away, whatever. But you have lichens, and you have orchids, and you have animals that are small and do not move very far away. And so when you leave trees behind on your property, either individually or in patches, then you're providing a function there. What you're trying to do is lifeboat them into the next generation. So you're hoping that they'll stay alive long enough in those small patches until the regen comes up and provides them from an opportunity to survive. You're also leaving behind structural features on the landscape at the stand level, perhaps even at the landscape level, that are going to provide habitat opportunities for things that like old growth structural features. Large diameter coarse wood material, snag trees, basically cavity trees, just big trees in general. And the other thing that retention does, it provides some way for animals and plants to get across the landscape. Whether or not it's at the stand level or whether or not it's at a landscape level, by leaving trees behind, you're leaving opportunities for organisms to move across the land. And so that's, again, theoretical, but that's the three reasons why we do that. One of the biggest take-home messages that I'd like to leave you with here, basically, and this in fact is the single take-home message. If I was to condense 2.5 hours into literally 5 minutes, I would say this, that the greater the structural variability, the greater the diversity of diversities that you have on your property at the end of the day, the better it's going to be for biodiversity in general. So by having something like this, it's providing more opportunities for different types of biodiversity. Not necessarily if you have a species at risk that's got very specific habitat requirements, but generally speaking, most organisms, if we, as one person often said to me, the messier the better. Keep it messy and biodiversity is going to enjoy that. And here you see coarse woody material on the forest floor. We see standing live trees. We see a number of features that I'm going to talk about here this morning. So with respect to the structure, just keep in mind, I guess basically, since I just said the greater the structural variability that you have, the better it's going to be for biodiversity. Here's just a classic example. We see a plantation situation on the top left and an old field situation on the bottom left. And again, you see that there's very little in the way of structure there. You've got the standing trees, the crop itself, as opposed to what we typically think of old growth, where you get into those situations where you have large old trees, you have dead trees, you have coarse wood material on the forest floor, you have pit and mound topography, you have all kinds of different microhabitats and structural elements in an old growth situation, or at least an old forest situation that you wouldn't have in a plantation, for example. And so those are two extremes, and you would expect that there's a lot more diversity of life in the old growth than you will in the plantation. The plantation is not devoid of growth. It just means that basically there's probably a very limited number of species that actually live there. Tree microhabitats, this is something else. This is an easy one really for most people. Studies on microhabitats on trees is very popular in Europe. It has been for the past 20 years. In lots of locations there, they've spent a century or two sterilizing their forests in terms of, we've all seen the stereotypical European forests. They've come to realize that because of that, they have very limited opportunities in biodiversity. And as a result now, they're going out and actually physically breaking trees, they're barking trees, they're trying to create rot. They want fungus to invade, they want cavities to form. And so you look at these types of things, there's actually 14 different types of microhabitats that are recognized on trees, of which I've only put 8 here, just for the sake of simplicity. But everything from lichens as a substrate for things to live on, we all have trees with lichens, easy enough to do. Shaggy bark, fungus, epiphytes, the witch's broom, cracks in the bark, and exudae. So we have sap running on trees. That is a food source, for something else. When it comes to providing structure, we can talk about horizontal structure, and we can talk about vertical structure. And it's, again, horizontal structure is just basically the way that the regeneration, perhaps, or the shrub layer expresses itself across the forest floor. And again, used by a wide variety of organisms, everything from salamanders to small mammals to birds, insects, a number of things. Again, try to promote as much of that horizontal structure as you can in your woodlot somewhere, and you'll be benefiting these types of animals. Similarly, we have vertical structure. We have vertical stratification that we should be looking forward to trying to create. And this graphic here, this slide here is just showing you different bird species that use very different levels, strata, layers within the canopy and the undercanopy, right down to the shrub layer and herbaceous layer of the forest floor. And so again, keeping in mind, part of the reason I'm doing this is just to give you some idea as to why. It's one thing for me to tell you you keep vertical stratification, but it's another thing if I can explain it to you why it is it's important for you to do that. And in this particular case, this is one of those situations in which there are very distinct bird groups that live or feed or nest, whatever, in different layers of the forest. And so by maintaining that variety somewhere on your property, you're going to be hopefully facilitating those species. Permanent reserve trees, if you've looked in the SGM at all, the Silviculture Guide to Ecological Matrix, you realize that anywhere from 15 to 20 trees per hectare are supposed to be left as permanent reserve trees. And these can be anything from super canopy trees to live cavity trees. They can be unusual species that are uncommon on your property, like a clean beech. They could be a species at risk tree type of thing, such as a black ash. Something like that that is a bit unusual that is going to pay benefits down the road. And so the whole permanent reserve tree issue is something that we're working through right now, I guess, in terms of that 15 to 20 trees per hectare. depending on the type of site that it is. When we talk about retention, there are two types. There's deadwood retention, and under the SGEM, all snag trees are supposed to be left that don't pose a safety hazard, and so that's not much of an issue. We also have green tree retention, which is the live trees. And so the 15 to 20 trees that I mentioned before, those are live trees that are supposed to be left, because all snags are supposed to be left regardless, and they don't count towards the 15 to 20. But each of them plays a particularly important role when it comes to biodiversity conservation. And so snag trees can provide feeding opportunities if there's cavities in them, or nesting opportunities if there's cavities in them, and feeding opportunities if there's insects in them. The shaggy bark, for instance, the little bird there on the top right, the little brown creeper, only nests underneath the bark. Of those, okay, thank you. Only 62 slides to go. So anyway, so basically, and bats will use those areas for daytime roosts. And snag and cavity trees, it mentions. Denning trees, cavities are used for denning, cavities are used for nesting. We have primary nesters, so basically these are the birds that actually create their own excavations in the trees, and such as chickadees, nuthatches. We all think of woodpeckers, but we don't often think of the other ones. Then we have the secondary cavity nest users, and those are the birds that go into the cavities that the primary cavity nesters create at some point in the future. And so, barred owls, woodpeckers, and tree swallows. When we're leaving cavity trees and thinking about your woodlot, basically these retention trees, we'd like to see them at least 30 centimeters DBH. The bigger the better. And that's going to be the rule of thumb with a lot of these things, is the bigger the tree you can leave behind, or clumps of trees, the bigger the better. They last longer, they provide more opportunities, especially for the bigger animals that don't otherwise have a chance to be there. We often have feeding cavities as sign. You'll see pileated woodpecker sign where they excavate the trees looking for ants. And we have sapsucker sign there, basically. Sap. Dens and denning cavities, different things on your property, keep an eye out for so that you can either incorporate them into a clump if you choose to. Bobcat, that rock pile on the left had a bobcat actually denning in it. There's a bear den on the top in the middle, and then just a hollow log that is an opportunity for other things to live in. And raccoon fisher. Lots of times you'll see fisher denning in big yellow birches. Coarse woody material, really important, really important feature to leave on your property to increase the structural diversity. Again, for something like rough grouse, did you know that basically rough grouse like to drum on logs that are about a foot big, foot across, foot wide, and 10 to 12 feet long? They don't necessarily like to use drumming logs that are smaller than that. So if you have that opportunity, you might certainly want to include those. Pine marten like to use ramps, or basically trees that are tipped over a little bit. They use those for going from the ground up into other trees to chase squirrels or do whatever they do, chase each other if nothing else. Coarse woody material is often good for small mammals. It's good for salamanders, reptiles in general. Provides a lot of opportunities. It presents an interesting challenge. How much is enough? This is a really critical question right now because of post-Fiona and the blowdown, the amount of salvage cutting going on. How much do you want to keep out there? I'm not going to get into that because we don't have the time, but it is a consideration. Sean mentioned the worries before of fire. A lot of this could potentially become fuel for fire, but on the other hand, once it decays to a certain level, it absorbs a lot of moisture and actually keeps the site wetter than it might otherwise. So it's a good thing. Stick nests are important to basically be aware of on your property. If you find a stick nest, make sure, talk about it with, perhaps call your local natural resources office and have somebody come identify it for you if you can't do it yourself. Preserving or looking after, we're down to getting down the crunch. So basically, mass producing trees and shrubs. So look after the berries on your property. If you can maintain, that's a good idea to do that. Hard mass, we have soft mass, hard mass. Soft mass are the berries, hard mass are the nuts. So these all provide excellent sources of protein for small mammals, for large mammals, for birds. So it's important if you have these on your property, be thinking about that a little bit. Protecting aquatic habitats is important. We spend a lot of time talking about wildlife habitat, water course protection regs in terms of streams, but there are other things as well in terms of vernal pools. These are critically important to a lot of wildlife in your areas. You know, basically salamanders, wood frogs, and fairy shrimp, which are really rare, but salamanders and wood frogs in particular only breed in these types of ponds. And so it's important that if you're going to maintain those ponds for these animals, if nothing else, that you do that. Wetlands and the importance of shrubs and wetland areas. I'm not going to go into this other than to say that basically wet shrubby areas are very, very important for songbirds in general. And you see that curve there, the top part of the curve, in wet shrubby areas. Be aware of species at risk on your property. If you're going to be managing and you're worried about biodiversity, speak to the local biologist and ask them to either come up to your property or sit down with a meeting with them and find out what's on your area. You know, is there white-tailed deer there? Is there a deer in your area? Do you have black ash that are living on the property? Wood turtles, it could be moose, it could be any number of the different species at risk that are on the property. But if that's one of the objectives for your management plan, to look after species at risk, then please, you know, make a point of talking to the right people to find out what you can do to enjoy it. There are 5 different species at risk forest birds that we have here in Nova Scotia, and basically what I did here, I was talking to Cindy earlier, and I took some of the habitat requirements for each of them, and I compared them to the best management practices that we actually are adopting in the SGM guide. And without going through all of them, because I don't have time now, but several of them are consistently beneficial, I guess, basically to these species at risk. And my point is, by practicing good ecological forestry, as per the SGM guide, you're going to be doing beneficial things for these species at risk birds as well. So in summary, use ecological forestry approaches when you can. Maintain as much structural heterogeneity or variety as you can. Keep all the pieces of the puzzle, basically what I'm saying. Building resilience, and by doing that, you're going to be building resiliency within your woodlot, and that resiliency is going to help mitigate any of the potential problems, or hopefully some of the potential problems that you may have coming up from climate change. And then recognizing there may be trade-offs to achieve your objectives. So no one woodlot can be everything to everybody. Right? You probably cannot meet every one of your objectives, depending on what they are, on every woodlot, but you might find ways to reach a middle ground that allows you to achieve the goals that you need. You know, the case in point with the coarse wood material. You know, some of the science will say that if you want to maintain 70% of all the species that require dead wood, that need dead wood, that you have to leave 90% of all the dead wood. By leaving 90% of all the dead wood, that may interfere with some of your silviculture, that may interfere with some planting, that may interfere with other things. So you have to achieve some sort of a balance in there. And finally, that's the last slide, so you are going to be able to eat really quickly. Is that outside there was the Forest Biodiversity Stewardship Guide. There's several copies of that out there. That a lot of the information that I've presented to you quickly here is found within that guide. And then we also have the FBC guide as well. So there's 2 potential sources of information on biodiversity and how you can incorporate biodiversity into your forest management practices and planning. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have blown through that so quickly, but keep it on schedule.